Hello, everyone, and thank you again for turning into My Apologies in Detroit podcast. Today, I wanted to bring up another topic that seems to come up frequently when I get into discussions with some of my friends. What the topic today I wanted to discuss is what does Christian growth look like, or what should it look like? Now, on one hand, this is an incredibly subjective question. Human beings learn in different ways. Some people learn by doing. Some people learn by reading. Some people learn just by seeing. And so, primarily speaking, the different ways some people learn. And so, on one hand, this whole concept of Christian growth is an incredibly subjective thing. Now, on the other hand, the Bible does give us some fairly clear expectations for what Christian growth should look like. And although we might not think of these passages in that context, I think that if you actually read them in context, that's what the intent of them were. Was to get us to remind us that with birth comes growth. The whole concept of birth was introduced into the, Christian lexicon by Jesus in John 3 when Nicodemus came to him and asked him about his teachings and what Jesus was teaching. And Jesus explained to Nicodemus, hey, if you are to become a Christian, you have to be born again. And what this means is you're going to change. The entire way that you grow and you live your life is going to be changed. Nicodemus didn't fully understand it at first, but Jesus in verse 8, I believe John 3 and verse 8, Nicodemus explained how, when you hear the wind blow and you can see its effect, but you don't really know where it's coming from. You have no clue where this wind is going, but you know that it's there because of its effect. And Jesus was making a point that when a person becomes born again, you can see that this person has been born again. You may not know when that second birth took place, but you can definitely see that the second birth has taken place because there are outward effects that reflect this internal change that has taken place. And I think some of the other New Testament writers kind of picked up on this analogy of second birth that Jesus introduced in John 3 and kind of built off of it. And Paul was one of those people who definitely did. Paul, more than one occasion, talked about the difference between desiring milk and desiring meat, implying that, babes, newer Christians, they need milk. They need simpler doctrine. They need simpler concepts and expectations, and whereas more mature Christians need meat, they need more robust theology. They need to have greater expectations in the way that they live and conduct themselves. And so today I just wanted to kind of reflect on some of these different things that the scriptures talk about when it's referring to more mature Christians. And just to kind of, take away a little bit of the subjectivity of what Christian growth should look like. Now, at the end of the day, as always, we have to be like the Bereans and search the scriptures and see whether or not these things are the case. And I always encourage you guys to do that, not just to take my word for it or to take what I interpret from the scriptures as what the scriptures ultimately imply, without vetting, checking those things out yourself. So I always encourage you to do that. And then some things that me personally that I believe about Christian growth aren't common in the church today. So those things might be a little more difficult to actually digest. But once again, you just have to check these things out for yourself and see whether or not these were what was implied when the writers of the New Testament were writing down what they were writing under the influence of the Holy Spirit. So let me take a crack at some of these things. Okay, so an very easy one to look at is the passage in Hebrews at the end of chapter 5 and at the beginning of chapter 6 when Paul not Paul necessarily because we don't know who the writer of Hebrews is, but where the writer of Hebrews points out that there was a group of Christians that had been walking or been Christians per se for an extended period of time, but weren't reflecting what Christian growth should look like. And so he talks about, the writer of Hebrews talks about how these people should no longer be desiring milk in the elementary things of the faith, of prayer and baptism and the elementary beginning things of Christianity, but should be to the point where they were able to teach what Christianity is about. And I think that that's a very significant statement. I don't think that all Christians are called to be teachers, but I think what the writer of Hebrews was implying, that all Christians are called to know and understand this message of the gospel and the general message of what the scriptures were talking about, the general message that it was communicating and sending, that God created man. Man committed sin and fell into a life of infection of sin. Jesus redeemed us with his work on the cross, and we are expected to reflect Jesus and the values of his kingdom here on earth. So I think that the writer of Hebrews is making a very poignant point that mature Christians should have fairly robust theology and should be able to communicate their theology to other people. This is part of what it means to mature and to be a Christian. Another passage that I think of is in Galatians when Paul is talking about the fruit of the Spirit, and when you initially look at this, it doesn't necessarily come off as necessarily this is what a mature Christian look like, but this is basically the gist of what Paul is implying. He's saying that a person who is indwelled with the Holy Spirit of God, their life is going to change, and the way that it's going to reflect that change is through the fruit of the Spirit. No longer will they reflect the fruit of the flesh as a general characterization of how they live their lives, but they will reflect the fruit of a spirit as a general characterization of how they live their life: love, joy, peace, kindness, faithfulness, goodness. So when you look at the fruit of the Spirit, I think that there's also an expectation of character change that you see when we begin to mature as Christians, and that we should expect. Another one I can think of is 1 John. In 1 John, John is talking about confession of sins and realization that even in our regenerated state, we're going to still battle and struggle with sin. And I think that that's one of the things that we learn as a mature Christian is, regardless of how much effort we put towards not sinning, we'll still find ourselves sinning, sometimes in thought, sometimes in deed. It may not be a general characterization of how we live our lives, which is one of the implications of being a mature Christian, but we will definitely continue to struggle with sin. And the mature Christian gets to the point to where they recognize this and to where they understand the importance of confession of sin and identifying sin in their lives. And so I think that's another thing that we can look at and walk away with as a mature Christian. A mature Christian recognizes that they're still a sinner. A mature Christian recognizes what the message of the gospel is and what the message of the message of the Bible is, and is capable of communicating that. In a mature Christian displays the fruit of the Spirit as a general characterization of the way that they live their lives versus displaying the fruit of the flesh as a very general characterization as the way they live their lives. That was back at that Galatians chapter 5 passage. Now, one of a great book, if you want to read, and a book that I'm attempting to commit to memory this year on the topic of Christian growth is James, the book of James. The book of James is great because it really gives you a very robust, practical look at the Christian life. It talks about persevering through trials and how that helps to mature us. It talks about how as Christians and maturing Christians, we should seek wisdom because wisdom reflects God. There's a whole chapter on that in Proverbs. It talks about once again confessing sins. It talks about the resistance of our own selfish desires. It talks about how often when the reason that we get into arguments and fights is because we have selfish desires battling within us, and we have to resist these. And we have to pray and use wisdom in prayer to seek the will of God, not just to live our lives to the satisfaction and gratification of what we desire. So, as always, with the Bible, much more can be said on a subject like this, but I just wanted to kind of give some teeth, so a little firmer ideology to what Christian growth looks like. And one of the more subjective ways of looking at this, the way I look at this is I look at how Jesus took his disciples, people who lived and had different professions. They weren't, rabbis. They weren't people who lived their lives teaching the Bible. He took these 11 guys, subtracting Judas, and when he left them after 3 years, their theology was robust enough. Their lives had changed enough to where they were able to turn the world upside down in a way that God had equipped them to. Now, on one hand, you can look at the fact and say that, well, hey, these people were special people that God had chosen for this specific task, which is true. But on the other hand, you have to look at God took normal, everyday people, or Jesus took normal, everyday people in this, and their lives were changed significantly over a 3-year period of time. And I think that a 3-year period of time is a reasonable period of time to kind of gauge Christian growth. If a person has truly been converted, you should see some very significant growth over the course of 3 years. But anyway, that's the gist of what I wanted to share today, and thanks for tuning in. And please, as always, check these things out, share your thoughts,